On a bright spring morning in Atlanta, Superior Court Judge Michael Stevens sat behind his mahogany desk, reviewing cases. The courthouse buzzed with activity when Sarah Williams entered the courtroom, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder and a stack of papers tucked under her arm. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Judge Stevens had already handled 15 cases that morning, and his reputation for efficiency preceded him. His colleagues often joked that he could clear a docket faster than anyone else in the district. Today, however, something felt different. Perhaps it was the unusual spring warmth, or maybe it was the way his coffee tasted slightly bitter, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this day would be memorable. Sarah Williams walked confidently through the security checkpoint, exchanging pleasant smiles with the courthouse staff. Her simple yet elegant attire, a navy blazer over a cream blouse and tailored pants, spoke of understated sophistication. She checked her watch, noting she had arrived 20 minutes early for her scheduled appearance. The courtroom clerk, Mrs. Thompson, a veteran of 30 years in the justice system, noticed something distinctive about Sarah. Unlike most people who entered the courtroom with trepidation, Sarah carried herself with quiet confidence. She took her seat in the third row, carefully arranging her documents while observing the proceedings. Judge Stevens continued through his morning calendar, his authoritative voice echoing through the chamber. He prided himself on reading people quickly, a skill he believed essential for his position. From his elevated bench, he noticed Sarah reviewing her papers, her reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose as she made neat annotations in the margins. The cases before Sarah's ranged from minor disputes to complex property matters. Each received the judge's trademark, swift justice, quick assessments followed by firm decisions. The gallery slowly emptied as cases concluded, leaving only a handful of people when the clerk called Sarah's name. As Sarah approached the podium, Judge Stevens glanced at the case file. His expression remained neutral, but his eyes narrowed slightly at what he perceived as a straightforward matter. The morning sun had shifted, and now the light fell directly across his desk, illuminating the particles of dust floating in the air between them. Sarah began to speak, her voice clear and measured. The courthouse clock ticked steadily in the background, marking each moment of what would soon prove to be a pivotal encounter. Neither of them could have predicted how their paths would cross again, or how this seemingly routine morning would catalyze significant changes in the Atlanta legal community. In the gallery, a young law student observed intently, taking notes for her class assignment on courtroom procedures. She would later recall this moment in her journal, noting the unusual tension in the air, something that transcended the typical formality of legal proceedings. The air conditioning hummed softly, providing a subtle backdrop to the scene. Unfolding in courtroom 4-8 outside, the city of Atlanta continued its morning rush, unaware of the significant moment taking place within these wood-paneled walls. Traffic moved steadily along the downtown streets, and the flowering dogwood swayed gently in the spring breeze, their white petals occasionally drifting past the courthouse windows. Judge Stevens straightened in his chair, preparing to hear what he assumed would be yet another routine case. He could not have known that this encounter would soon challenge everything he thought he knew about snap judgments and first impressions. The case before Judge Stevens appeared simple at first glance, a parking dispute at the prestigious Peachtree Plaza business complex. Sarah opened her leather portfolio, retrieving documentation that chronicled a series of events leading to her appearance in court. The morning light caught the gold accents of her fountain pen as she prepared to present her case. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice carrying a quiet authority, "I have documentation showing proper authorization for my vehicle's placement." She slid the first set of papers across to the clerk, who dutifully passed them to the judge. The documents were meticulously organized, with relevant sections highlighted and annotated. Judge Stevens barely glanced at the evidence, his mind already made up. He'd seen countless parking disputes, and in his experience, most people simply tried to talk their way out of their mistakes. The morning's heavy caseload had left him with little patience for what he perceived as elaborate excuses. "Ms. Williams," he interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of years on the bench. "The signage at Peachtree Plaza is perfectly clear. Your vehicle was photographed in a restricted area." He tapped his pen against the bench, a habit he'd developed over years of showing his impatience with long-winded explanations. Sarah maintained her composure, attempting to direct his attention to a crucial detail in her documentation. "If you'll notice, Your Honor, page 3 contains written authorization from the building management, dated 2 weeks before the incident." Her finger traced the relevant paragraph. But Judge Stevens had already shifted his attention to the next document in his stack. The gallery watched with interest as the scene unfolded. Among them sat Mr. Chen, a property manager from a neighboring building, who recognized Sarah, but couldn't quite place where he'd seen her before. He leaned forward, intrigued by the unusual dynamic developing before him. "Ms. Williams," Judge Stevens continued, his tone growing more stern, "this court's time is valuable. The standard fine for this violation is $250, but given your attempt to complicate a straightforward matter, I'm setting the fine at $500. Perhaps this will encourage more attention to parking regulations in the future." Sarah's expression remained neutral, though those watching closely might have noticed a slight raise of her eyebrow. She carefully gathered her unused evidence, including an email thread with the building's security chief and time-stamped photographs showing proper parking permits. The young law student in the gallery furiously scribbled notes, recognizing that something unusual was happening. The judge's dismissive handling of documented evidence seemed to contradict the procedural fairness she'd been studying. "Thank you for your time, Your Honor," Sarah responded professionally, her voice betraying no hint of the thoughts running through her mind. She methodically returned her documents to her portfolio, each movement deliberate and composed. As she turned to leave the courtroom, the morning sun cast her shadow long across the floor, reaching almost to the judge's bench. The symbolism would later strike Judge Stevens as particularly poignant, though at that moment he was already calling the next case, Sarah's matter dismissed from his mind. The courthouse clock showed 10:45 a.m. as Sarah exited courtroom 4A. She walked purposefully toward the elevator, exchanging a knowing smile with Mrs. Thompson, the clerk who had watched the entire proceeding with growing interest. The day was far from over, and in a few hours, this brief courtroom encounter would take on an entirely different significance. That same evening, Judge Stevens adjusted his silk tie as he walked through the gleaming entrance of the Capital City Club. The prestigious venue's marble floors echoed with his confident footsteps, each click reinforcing his sense of belonging among Atlanta's elite. The setting sun painted the crystal chandeliers in warm hues, creating an atmosphere of refined elegance. He nodded to familiar faces, other judges, prominent attorneys, and city officials who frequented the club. Tonight's quarterly judicial review meeting seemed routine, though he noticed an unusual buzz of anticipation among his colleagues. Several whispered conversations stopped as he passed, drawing his curiosity but not quite enough to make him pause. "Good evening, Judge Stevens," called Marcus Richardson, a senior member of the State Bar Association. "I trust you're prepared for tonight's meeting." There was something in Marcus's tone, a hint of amusement that made Stevens slightly uneasy. Before he could inquire further, Marcus had already moved on, engaged in conversation with another member. The private dining room doors loomed ahead, their polished brass handles reflecting the warm lighting. Through the frosted glass panels, Stevens could make out several silhouettes already seated around the massive oak table. He checked his Rolex, 6:55 p.m., perfectly punctual as always. As he reached for the door handle, Jennifer Chen, his longtime colleague from the appellate court, touched his arm lightly. "Michael," she said softly, "you might want to take a deep breath before you go in." Her cryptic smile only added to his growing sense that this evening would be different from the usual quarterly meetings. The heavy doors swung open smoothly, revealing the private dining room in its full splendor. Crystal glasses sparkled under the chandelier light, white tablecloths pristine against the deep burgundy walls. But it wasn't the room's elegance that caused Judge Stevens to pause mid-step. There, at the head of the table, sat Sarah Williams. The casual attire from the morning had been replaced by an impeccable black suit, her hair elegantly styled, and a subtle pearl necklace gracing her neck. She was engaged in what appeared to be an intense discussion with the state's Chief Justice, who listened to her with rapt attention. The conversation around the table hushed momentarily as Stevens entered, then resumed with a subtle undercurrent of anticipation. He found his designated seat, marked by an elegant place card, 3 spaces down from Sarah. The proximity felt suddenly uncomfortable. "Shall we begin?" Sarah's voice carried across the table with natural authority, bringing the murmured conversations to a halt. She rose gracefully, commanding the attention of everyone present. "For those I haven't had the pleasure of meeting personally, I'm Sarah Williams, newly appointed chairperson of the State Judicial Board." Judge Stevens felt the color drain from his face as the morning's events replayed in his mind. The carefully prepared evidence he dismissed, the increased fine, his dismissive tone, all of it took on a new, mortifying significance. He reached for his water glass, hoping to hide his discomfort behind a sip. "Tonight," Sarah continued, her gaze sweeping the room with purposeful engagement, "we'll be discussing several key initiatives aimed at improving our judicial system's efficiency and fairness." Her eyes met Stevens briefly, showing no sign of recognition or remembrance of their earlier encounter. The evening stretched before him like an endless expanse, each minute promising new possibilities for embarrassment or revelation. As Sarah began outlining the meeting's agenda, Judge Stevens found himself, perhaps for the first time in his career, completely unsure of what would happen next. As Sarah Williams stood at the head of the table, her presence commanded attention without demanding it. The soft glow of the dining room's chandeliers highlighted her professional demeanor as she began reviewing the quarterly performance metrics of each judicial district. Judge Stevens found himself shifting uncomfortably in his leather chair, acutely aware of his morning's performance. "Our first agenda item," Sarah announced, laying out a series of detailed reports, "concerns the implementation of our new Judicial Fairness Initiative." She gestured to the thick folders placed before each attendee. "These reports highlight some concerning trends in our courtrooms, particularly regarding consistency in decision-making and fine assessments." The Chief Justice nodded approvingly as Sarah navigated through PowerPoint slides displaying detailed statistics. Her Stanford law background shone through in her precise analysis and thoughtful recommendations. Stevens tried to focus on the data, but his mind kept returning to their morning encounter, each memory more cringeworthy than the last. "Of particular interest," Sarah continued, her voice steady and professional, "is the variation in fine amounts across similar cases." She clicked to a new slide showing a graph. "As you can see, some courts show significant disparities, even for identical violations." Her eyes swept across the room, not lingering on any one person, yet Stevens felt each word like a personal rebuke. Jennifer Chen, seated across from Stevens, raised her hand. "These findings are quite revealing, Chairperson Williams. What measures do you propose to address these inconsistencies?" The question hung in the air as Sarah smiled, clearly prepared for this discussion. "Excellent question, Judge Chen," Sarah replied, pulling up another slide. "We're proposing the 3-tiered approach to standardizing our judicial responses." She outlined a comprehensive plan that would revolutionize how judges handled routine cases, emphasizing fairness and consistency. Throughout her presentation, Sarah maintained absolute professionalism, never once indicating any recognition of her morning encounter with Stevens. Yet each point she made seemed to highlight another aspect of his earlier behavior that now made him wince internally. The state's Chief Justice leaned forward, clearly impressed. "Chairperson Williams, your analysis is outstanding. Your experience in judicial reform is evident in every aspect of this proposal." Several other board members nodded in agreement, while Stevens struggled to maintain his composure. As the meeting progressed, Sarah fielded questions with remarkable expertise, drawing from her 15 years of experience in judicial reform. She discussed landmark cases, cited relevant precedents, and demonstrated a depth of knowledge that made her morning's courtroom appearance even more significant in retrospect. "Before we break for dinner," Sarah announced, "I'd like to address one final point." She pulled up a slide showing courthouse accessibility statistics. "Our studies show that morning dockets often include working professionals who deserve the same thorough consideration as any other case, regardless of time constraints." The pointed relevance of this observation wasn't lost on Stevens, who took a long sip of water to hide his discomfort. Around him, other judges were taking detailed notes, clearly impressed by the new chairperson's insights and vision for improvement. As servers began bringing in the first course, Sarah closed her presentation with a quote about justice and equality that seemed to resonate with everyone present. The room broke into appreciative applause, while Stevens found himself clapping mechanically, his mind racing with the implications of this new dynamic. Sarah took her seat gracefully, engaging in easy conversation with those around her. Her natural leadership ability and extensive knowledge had transformed what was usually a dry quarterly meeting into an engaging discussion about meaningful change. For Judge Stevens, however, the evening had only begun, and the carefully plated appetizer before him suddenly seemed very unappetizing indeed. The dinner portion of the evening commenced with quiet elegance as Sarah expertly guided discussions around the massive oak table. Sterling silverware clinked against fine china while she addressed the board members' concerns about implementing new judicial guidelines. Even as she led complex policy discussions, she maintained an air of approachability that drew admiration from everyone present. "Your proposal about standardizing fine structures is particularly intriguing," commented Judge Harrison, a senior member of the board. "Could you elaborate on how you envision this working in practice?" He leaned forward, genuinely interested in her response, while Stevens picked at his grilled salmon, each bite tasting like cardboard. Sarah outlined her vision with precision, drawing from her experience at prestigious law firms and her tenure as a legal reform consultant. "Consider this morning, for example," she began, causing Stevens to nearly choke on his water. "I observed several cases where similar violations received drastically different penalties. This inconsistency undermines public trust in our judicial system." The Chief Justice nodded thoughtfully. "Your Stanford Law thesis on judicial reform seems particularly relevant here. I remember reading it when your appointment was proposed." This revelation caused several eyebrows to raise, including Stevens, who was learning more about Sarah's credentials with each passing moment. As the main course plates were cleared, Sarah shared statistics that painted a clear picture of disparities in the current system. Her presentation included data from every district, showing patterns that had gone unnoticed until she compiled them. Stevens recognized his own court's numbers, now seeing them through a different lens. "What impresses me most," Jennifer Chen commented, "is how you've managed to identify these patterns without making accusations. Your approach focuses on improvement rather than blame." Several heads nodded in agreement, while Stevens found himself sinking slightly lower in his chair. Sarah's response was measured and thoughtful. "Our goal isn't to criticize, but to enhance the quality of justice we provide. Every judge in this room has valuable experience to contribute." Her eyes swept the table, passing over Stevens without any hint of their morning encounter, yet he felt the weight of her words. The discussion turned to implementation strategies, with Sarah fielding questions about training programs and monitoring systems. Her answers revealed not only her deep understanding of judicial procedures, but also her practical experience in implementing systemic changes. "We'll be establishing a mentorship program," she announced, pulling out additional documents from her leather portfolio, the same one Stevens had barely glanced at that morning. "This will allow judges to share their expertise while ensuring consistency across districts." As dessert was served, a delicate crème brûlée that Stevens couldn't bring himself to touch, the Chief Justice raised his water glass. "To our new chairperson," he proposed, "your first day has already brought fresh perspective to our proceedings." The irony of this statement caused Stevens to grip his own glass a bit too tightly. Sarah accepted the toast graciously, using the moment to emphasize the collaborative nature of their upcoming work. Her ability to maintain professional composure while discussing reforms that directly addressed behaviors she'd experienced firsthand spoke volumes about her character. The evening drew to a close with Sarah, distributing detailed action plans for the coming quarter. Each folder contained personalized recommendations for different districts, including Stephen's own. As he glanced through his copy, he noticed several points that seemed to directly reference his courtroom practices, though they were presented as general observations rather than specific criticism. Throughout it all, Sarah maintained her poise and professionalism, never once indicating that she had experienced firsthand the very issues she was now tasked with reforming. The setting sun cast long shadows through the dining room's windows, marking the end of a day that had begun so differently than it was ending. During a brief recess in the meeting, Judge Stevens found himself alone with Sarah in the club's ornate hallway. The classical music from the main dining room provided a subtle backdrop as he gathered his courage to address the morning's events. Before he could speak, Sarah smoothly steered the conversation toward professional matters. "Judge Stevens," she began, her voice carrying the same measured tone she'd used all evening, "I've been reviewing your district's case management statistics. Your efficiency rates are quite impressive." She opened a leather-bound portfolio, different from the one she'd carried that morning, producing a chart that detailed his courtroom's performance metrics. The compliment caught him off guard, especially given their earlier interaction. His usual confidence faltered as he searched for an appropriate response. "Chairperson Williams, about this morning's case," he started, but Sarah gracefully continued her analysis of his district's performance. "Your swift processing of cases is noteworthy," she observed, pointing to specific data points. "However, I wonder if we might discuss strategies for maintaining that efficiency while ensuring each case receives thorough consideration." Her subtle emphasis on thorough made Stevens wince internally. The mahogany-paneled walls seemed to close in as other board members passed by, nodding respectfully to Sarah. Stevens noticed how each person who approached her received her full attention, regardless of their position or status. It was a stark contrast to his own behavior that morning. "I've been thinking," Sarah continued, skillfully guiding their conversation, "about implementing a pilot program in high-performing courts like yours. Something that combines efficiency with comprehensive case review." She pulled out another document, this one outlining an innovative approach to docket management. Stevens found himself genuinely intrigued by her proposals, despite his discomfort. "That's an interesting approach," he managed, studying the document she'd handed him. "I hadn't considered some of these methods." The irony of learning about thorough case review from someone whose case he'd dismissed so quickly wasn't lost on him. A passing waiter offered them coffee, providing a momentary break in the conversation. Sarah accepted graciously, her pearl necklace catching the light as she turned to thank the server. Stevens noticed how she addressed the staff with the same respect she showed to the Chief Justice. "Your experience in streamlining court procedures could be valuable to this initiative," Sarah noted, returning to their discussion. "Perhaps you'd consider sharing your insights at our next workshop." Her ability to focus on his potential contributions, rather than his earlier behavior, spoke volumes about her character. The grandfather clock in the corridor chimed softly, marking the hour. Sarah glanced at her watch, the same one she'd worn in court that morning, though it seemed to carry different significance now. "We should rejoin the others," she suggested, gathering her materials with practiced efficiency. As they walked back toward the meeting room, Stevens felt the weight of unspoken words between them. Sarah's professional demeanor had given him no opening to address their morning encounter, yet her every action served as a masterclass in judicial conduct. "Chairperson Williams," he tried one final time, pausing at the meeting room door. But Sarah was already greeting another board member who had approached with questions about the new initiatives. Her ability to maintain focus on the larger goals, rather than personal matters, made Stevens increasingly aware of his own need for professional growth. The evening's formal proceedings resumed, with Sarah leading discussions about future reforms. Stevens found himself paying attention with newfound intensity, seeing each proposal through the lens of his morning's behavior. The lesson she was teaching extended far beyond the formal presentation, embedded in every interaction and response she demonstrated. In the weeks following the board meeting, Judge Stevens' courtroom underwent a subtle but significant transformation. The morning sunlight still streamed through the tall windows, but it illuminated a different atmosphere. Where once he rushed through cases with swift efficiency, he now took time to study each document presented before him. Mrs. Thompson, his longtime clerk, noticed the change first. One Tuesday morning, she watched as he carefully reviewed evidence in a parking dispute similar to Sarah's case. Instead of his usual rapid-fire questioning, he listened intently to the defendant's explanation, examining each piece of documentation with newfound attention. "Your Honor seems different lately," a young prosecutor commented during a recess. Stevens merely nodded, his mind drifting to the leather portfolio Sarah had carried that day, the one containing evidence he'd never bothered to review. He'd begun keeping a journal of his daily cases, noting patterns in his decision-making that he'd never previously considered. The courthouse regulars adapted to his new approach. Morning dockets that once rushed through cases now moved at a more measured pace. Stevens found himself making eye contact with each person who stood before him, really seeing them rather than just processing their cases. One particularly busy morning, a woman appeared before him for a minor infraction. Like Sarah, she carried a folder full of documentation. Unlike that fateful day, Stevens took time to review each page, discovering mitigating circumstances that would have been missed under his old approach. The grateful look in the woman's eyes reminded him of why he'd become a judge in the first place. His colleagues noticed the transformation too. Judge Chen stopped by his chambers one afternoon, coffee in hand. "Whatever sparked this change in you, Michael, it's remarkable," she observed, watching him meticulously review case files for the next day's docket. "Your reputation is shifting from Swift Stevens to something more considered." The statistics reflected his evolution. While his courtroom's efficiency metrics remained impressive, the appeal rate for his decisions dropped significantly. He began receiving letters from citizens who'd appeared before him, thanking him for taking time to truly hear their cases. Each letter found its way into a folder he kept as a reminder of the impact a judge's attention could have. During lunch breaks, Stevens often found himself in the courthouse library, researching cases similar to those on his docket. The security guard grew accustomed to finding him there, surrounded by law books and taking detailed notes. It reminded him of his early days on the bench, before efficiency became his primary measure of success. One rainy morning, he arrived early to find Sarah's quarterly report in his inbox. As he reviewed the statistics, he noticed his court's numbers standing out, not for speed this time, but for thoroughness and fairness. The satisfaction he felt was different from his old pride in rapid case clearance. The young law student who'd witnessed Sarah's case returned for another assignment. She barely recognized the courtroom atmosphere. "Judge Stevens actually smiled today," she whispered to her classmate. "And did you see how carefully he reviewed that zoning dispute?" His transformation extended beyond the courtroom. At judicial conferences, he began sharing his experiences, speaking candidly about the importance of thorough case review. Without mentioning Sarah directly, he used his own journey as a teaching tool for other judges facing similar pressures to prioritize speed over substance. As the weeks turned to months, Stevens realized that Sarah's brief appearance in his courtroom had catalyzed more than just professional change. He'd rediscovered the fundamental purpose of his role, not just to process cases, but to ensure each person received true justice, regardless of their appearance, status, or the time of day. 6 months after the memorable board meeting, Judge Stevens stood at the podium during the annual judicial conference in downtown Atlanta. The grand ballroom was filled with judges, lawyers, and legal professionals from across the state. As he adjusted the microphone, his eyes scanned the audience, noting Sarah's presence in the front row. "My fellow members of the judiciary," he began, his voice carrying the humility that would have been foreign to him half a year ago. Today I want to share a story about transformation." The room fell silent, attention focused on the judge known for his recent evolution in the legal community. He recounted the story of a routine morning that changed everything, carefully avoiding specific details but emphasizing the lessons learned. "We often speak of justice being blind," he continued, "but there's a difference between being blind to bias and being blind to humanity." As he spoke, heads nodded throughout the audience. Many had witnessed his transformation firsthand, and some had even adopted similar changes in their own courtrooms. The statistics displayed on the screen behind him told a compelling story: increased satisfaction rates, fewer appeals, and more equitable decisions across all demographics. Halfway through his presentation, Sarah rose from her seat and made her way to the stage. The audience watched as she joined him at the podium, their first public interaction since that fateful morning. "Judge Stevens," she announced, "your journey exemplifies the very essence of judicial growth." Together, they unveiled a new mentorship program designed to help judges balance efficiency with thorough case consideration. Stevens would serve as one of the lead advisors, turning his experience into a teaching tool for others. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone who knew the full story. Change, Sarah addressed the audience, often comes from unexpected moments that make us question our established patterns. She glanced at Stevens with professional appreciation. "Judge Stevens has demonstrated that it's never too late to enhance our approach to justice." The conference room buzzed with energy as they outlined the program's details. Young judges in the audience took careful notes, while seasoned veterans nodded in recognition of truths they'd discovered through their own experiences. The atmosphere was one of collective purpose and shared commitment to improvement. As the presentation concluded, spontaneous applause filled the room. Stevens noticed the young law student who had witnessed the original case, now an intern at the state Supreme Court, smiling knowingly from her seat. She had watched the entire story unfold, from that spring morning to this moment of transformation. During the reception that followed, judges from across the state approached Stevens to share similar stories of moments that had changed their perspective. Sarah moved through the crowd with her characteristic grace, connecting with colleagues and continuing to build bridges for positive change in the judicial system. The evening ended with an informal gathering where Stevens and Sarah finally had a moment to acknowledge their shared history. "Thank you," he said simply, both knowing no further explanation was needed. Sarah's response was equally measured. "The best thanks is in the lives you've impacted since then." As the conference drew to a close, Stevens gathered his materials, including the new mentorship program guidelines. The setting sun cast long shadows through the ballroom's windows, much like it had that morning in his courtroom. But now those shadows reminded him not of authority maintained, but of wisdom gained. The story of the judge and the chairperson became something of a legend in Atlanta's legal circles, though few knew all the details. It served as a reminder that true justice requires not just knowledge of the law, but the wisdom to recognize that every case deserves thorough consideration, and every person deserves to be truly heard.